Su-non lowered her head. She saw Ariel's sisters floating on the sea surface. They were looking at her with their heads tilted back, full of worrying. "Are you all right?" one of the mermaids asked. Su-non nodded. She couldn't speak. She could only use her eyes to ask them how the day went. "We found the sea witch. We asked him if there was a way to turn you back into a mermaid." One mermaid swam closer. Only then did Su-non notice. Their thick, long hair from the day was all gone, but apart from the hair, their appearances were no different from during the day. Su-non was a bit puzzled, but she had no way of asking now. "We traded our hair with him." The mermaid held up a dagger. The dagger reflected a cold gleam under the moonlight. "Use this dagger to kill the prince. Smear his blood on your legs. Your legs will transform back into a fishtail, and you'll have a long life once more." The sharp dagger was held up by a snow-white palm. It gleamed coldly. It was obviously sharp. Su-non reached out and took the dagger. The moment she gripped it, the system's voice immediately sounded in her mind. "Congratulations, player. You have obtained a key plot item. A magical dagger capable of killing the prince." Description: from the copy The Little Mermaid, can only be used in the Little Mermaid copy. Taking it out will render it ineffective, as the name suggests. This is a magical dagger that can kill the prince if you want to use it to peel an apple. I can only remind you to be careful not to get hurt. It seems this method is right. My dear sister, you shouldn't be blinded again by foolish so-called love, and disappoint us again, right? One of the mermaids asked loudly. Her voice was ethereal and melodious. A pair of beautiful eyes stared intently at her. Su-non couldn't speak. She could only shake her head vigorously. Her gaze was firm. The mermaids began to sing a mermaid song around her. As they sang, pure white pearls rolled down from the corners of their eyes. Legend says that mermaid tears, when turned into pearls, hold magical power. Su-non looked at this scene that only existed in fantasy, and her heart stirred slightly. She grabbed the rope tightly, and slowly climbed down the side of the ship, until her lower body was completely submerged in the water. The mermaids immediately swam forward to embrace her. Su-non took the opportunity to grasp the pearls formed from their tears. In her hand, they still seemed to carry a bit of warmth. At the same time, the system's voice sounded again. "Congratulations, player. You have obtained mermaid tears." Description: produced from the copy The Little Mermaid. Mermaid tears contain the sincere emotions of mermaids. They can reduce pollution levels when used. They can also be used as beautiful decorations. Su-non was slightly stunned. She felt like the small pearls in her hand were burning hot. No wonder the mermaids' appearances didn't change at night. It turned out that their tears could actually reduce pollution levels. The mermaids each kissed her cheek and offered her blessings, wishing that she could kill the prince as soon as possible, and return to the embrace of the sea. Su-non tucked the pearls into her sleeve. She grabbed the rope and climbed back onto the ship and leapt in. Her feet landed on the deck. Even the stoic Su-non couldn't help but grimace in pain. The night sea looked even more vast. The dark, deep sea was surging in front of her. Among it, the mermaids, reluctant to leave, waved goodbye to her. She opened her palm. Several pearls emitted a soft, lustrous glow under the moonlight. She took one out and swallowed it. A system notification immediately appeared in her mind. Pollution level decreased. One pearl can reduce pollution by 10 points. Pollution will no longer decrease after reaching 10%. She put the remaining pearls away. The danger of pollution was temporarily relieved. Next, she should go take a look at the storage room on the first floor of the cabin. Su-non guessed that there must be clues she needed there. When she passed by there during the day, she noticed that the door leading to the lower level was secured with a huge lock. It was still there now. Luckily, she was prepared. She placed the candle she had swiped from the wall earlier on the ground and took out the pearl hairpin Lily had given her. She fumbled and inserted the tip into the lock eye. She moved it around a few times, and the lock was actually opened. Su-non had lost her parents at a young age. She had grown up with her grandparents in the countryside. She was like a wild monkey since she was little. Without any manners, she loved to run around. Her lockpicking skills were learned when she was a child in the countryside. She had learned it for fun from a locksmith. She never expected it to come in handy here. She carefully took off the lock and gently placed it on the ground beside her. She picked up the candle nearby and shined it down into the black abyss. She couldn't help but let out a soft breath. Just standing at the entrance of the storage room, she could feel wisps of cold air wafting out from it. She held the candle and carefully walked down the stairs. So cold was her first impression. The further down she went, the stronger the cold air became. She walked for a while and felt her feet finally touch the ground. She raised the candle in her hand, illuminating the room before her. She was so shocked by the scene before her that she almost forgot to move. This wasn't a storage room at all. It was clearly a slaughterhouse. A huge table stood in the center of the room. It was covered in bloodstains, with some unknown pieces of meat scattered around. Large piles of ice were stacked in the corners of the room, emitting a slight chill. The floor was completely covered in ice. The melted water mixed with blood turning into puddles of filthy sewage. On the walls hung many dried meats of some unknown animals, emitting a greasy smell. It was exceptionally strange. When she thought about the food they had eaten today, which might have been made from these things, Sunon's stomach twisted in nausea. Luckily for her, to be safe, she hadn't consumed any meat. She pinched her nose and raised the candle and began to search the surroundings. When she passed a huge stone vat, she suddenly heard a slight noise coming from the entrance of the storage room. The sound was already at the door. It would definitely be too late to leave through the door now. Sunon's body reacted faster than her brain. She decisively blew out the candle in her hand and lifted the lid of the stone vat and climbed inside. Then she closed the lid. As soon as she climbed in, Sunon regretted it. She crouched down and clearly felt herself press against a soft object. She couldn't see anything in the darkness, but her ears became even more sensitive. There was an extremely faint sound of breathing behind her. It felt like a cool breeze was blowing from behind her ear. Sunon's whole body broke out in goosebumps. In an instant, her hair stood on end. She stiffly turned her head. She couldn't see anything. She couldn't see anything at all, but she knew clearly that there was someone else in this vat. She couldn't speak, and this person hadn't said anything either. The two of them were silent in the darkness. A rough voice was the first to sound. "How is the lock open, Zok? Did you forget to lock the door?" "Bullshit, do you think I'm you?" The man called Zok spat out a mouthful of phlegm, muttering curses. "It must be those people who came to pick up the goods who weren't paying attention. I'll teach them a lesson tomorrow." "Alright, keep your voice down. Don't wake people up," another man grunted. "There can't be any mistakes before the wedding. Hurry up and move these goods inside. These are all the finest goods that the prince carefully selected for the wedding." "What are you afraid of? They're probably sleeping soundly right now," although Zok said so. His hands started to move along with him. Sunon frowned, while paying attention to the sounds outside. She had to be careful of the mysterious person beside her. From the time she entered till now, the person next to her had remained silent, and hadn't taken any action against her, aside from a faint breathing. His voice barely sounded like a living person. She could only wait and see what happens. The two people outside stopped talking. They were probably carrying goods. Suddenly, she heard the sound of heavy objects being dragged across the ground. A loud thud suddenly came from outside the stone vat. She was startled and instinctively held her breath. She put her ear against the wall of the stone vat, carefully listening to the movements outside. "Don't be so clumsy," Lark scolded. "Why isn't this guy making any noise? Could he be dead?" The other man questioned with suspicion. Wasn't he still making noises during the day? Clear footsteps suddenly sounded outside. They seemed to stop in front of the stone vat. Sunon's heart jumped into her throat. She gripped the dagger in her hand tightly. If the lid was lifted, she would have nowhere to hide in the stone vat. She had to seize the opportunity to take out one of them first. "You've already gagged his mouth and tied up his hands and feet. How can he struggle?" Zok said impatiently. "It's almost dawn. We need to go. Hurry up." Sunon suddenly realized the person they were talking about was very likely the person behind her. No wonder he hadn't moved from the beginning, or spoken a word. It turned out his mouth was gagged, and his hands and feet were tied. But why would they tie a person up here? "Okay," the other man responded. "The goods are all ready. Let's go." The sound of footsteps outside gradually faded away. Sunon's heart hadn't had time to calm down when she suddenly realized, once the people outside left, they would definitely lock the exit. Wouldn't she be trapped here to death? Cold sweat slid down her forehead. Calm down, calm down." She forced herself to calm down in the darkness. Her mind was racing, thinking about her current situation. Suddenly, she felt the person behind her move. The person behind her was Jaishi. She wasn't sure. Sunon had been paying attention to this person's movements since she came in. Her gaze turned cold. She held the dagger against the person in the darkness. If he knew what was good for him, he'd better not give her any trouble. The person behind her paused and let out a low whimpering sound from his throat, as if trying to speak. Sunon couldn't tell what his intention was. She hesitated for a moment. If he had wanted, he could have exposed her when those two were there. He could have done it, but he hadn't done so. Instead, he had only made a sound after the others had left. Perhaps he had something he wanted to say. She reached out with her other hand and fumbled to remove the wad of cloth from his mouth. "Thank the sea god." The man took a heavy breath. His voice was very weak. "Who are you? I thought you were also kidnapped." Sunon vaguely felt that this person might be able to solve a lot of her doubts, but due to her inability to speak, she couldn't answer. The person next to her didn't notice her silence and continued to speak on his own. "You have a dagger. Help me cut the ropes on my hands and feet quickly." Just as Sunon was hesitating, she suddenly heard movement outside again. "I'm still a little worried. I'll go down and take a look at that woman in the vat. If she's dead, the prince will definitely be furious," Zok said impatiently. "Then go quickly and come back quickly. I'll wait for you here." The person next to Sunon suddenly became tense. "Crap, If he sees you, he'll definitely tie you up too. The more it's like this, the less we can panic. Sunon tightly gripped the dagger in her hand, listening to the heavy footsteps getting closer. In the darkness, she touched the ropes binding the woman's body, and easily cut them open. What's the use of untying me now? The woman lowered her voice, and said dejectedly, we'll just be tied up again later. Her chest rose and fell rapidly with fear. She wiped the sweat from her palm, and gripped the dagger even tighter. Vaguely, light seeped in through the cracks in the lid. Heavy footsteps stopped outside the stone vat they were hiding in. Sunon held her breath and focused, gripping the dagger in her hand. She only had one chance, and the woman next to her seemed to have guessed what she was planning to do, and curled up without moving, not even daring to breathe heavily. Finally, the lid of the stone vat was lifted from the outside. Sunon narrowed her eyes, and finally saw the true face of the person who had come. He was holding a candle. The dim candlelight illuminated his face. He had a beard and a scar on the right side of his cheek. He didn't look like a good person at all. Sunon was like a snake lurking in the dark. She acted decisively, before the man could react. She stood up abruptly with the dagger raised, and directly plunged the dagger into his throat. She thought it would be difficult, but this dagger was so incredibly sharp. The moment it went into his throat, it was like cutting through tofu. It didn't take any effort at all. Blood sprayed out from his throat, splattering Sunon's face and body. The man's eyes widened in cold shock, as if he wanted to say something, but a gurgling sound came from his throat. Blood seeped from the corner of his mouth. He didn't even cry out. The candle in his hand rolled onto the ground. The flame flickered, but it didn't go out. The man stared at her with unblinking eyes. His large body fell backward, and crashed heavily onto the ground, making a muffled thud. This was the first time Sunon had faced something like this. Her face was as white as paper. Her stomach churned. She wanted to vomit, but she quickly adjusted her emotions. After all, this was not real. And the man in front of her, strictly speaking, was just a pile of data. This dagger was more useful than she had imagined. She took a few deep breaths and shook her hand. Then she turned to look at the woman, who had been with her since just now. She had long curly brown hair. Sunon's eyes widened slightly. She looked exactly like Lily. You really killed him. Joy after surviving a disaster flooded the woman's face. Her lips trembled. Does this mean I can escape? What sound was that? Zock's shout suddenly came from not far away. Jack, you bastard, what are you doing? I'm afraid it's not over yet. Sunon quickly calmed down. This man's accomplice would be down here soon, and when he saw Jack's body, he would know that there was someone else here. She quickly stepped out of the stone vat. Her gaze swept across the dim storage room, looking for the best place to ambush. The woman in the vat seemed to be scared stiff. She was still frozen there, in such a life and death moment. Sunon didn't have the time to care about others. Time was of the essence. She could already hear the man's heavy breathing. She acted decisively, hiding in the blind spot behind the stairs. The footsteps were getting closer and closer, followed by Zock's booming voice. If I find out you're messing with me, you know the consequences. Sunon's back pressed tightly against the wall, holding her breath, not daring to make a move. Finally, Zock walked down the stairs. He looked even taller than Jack. His back was as broad as a wall. If Sunon stood next to him, she probably only reached his chest. Who killed you? Zock immediately noticed. Jack's corpse lying on the ground. There was a bloody hole in his throat, and blood was still gushing out. The ground was covered in blood. Zock was enraged. His gaze quickly swept around the storage room, but he couldn't find the killer. He quickly reacted, and suddenly turned around, only to be confronted by a dagger gleaming coldly. Sunon raised her hand high, trying to stab the dagger into Zock's body, but he was too quick. Her hand only managed to graze his defending hand, and she was already being choked by Zock with one hand. You killed Jack? Zock asked in disbelief. How did you get in here? Sunon's face was turning red. The dagger in her hand clattered to the ground, and Zock kicked it away disdainfully. The air in her chest was becoming increasingly thin. She tightly grabbed Zock's hand, trying to pry his hand open, but his hand was as solid as a pillar. Her strength was completely unable to move it even slightly. Her consciousness began to blur. Was she going to die here, before the last day arrived? The fairy tale world must be beautiful. Wait. A glimmer of clarity flashed through Sunon's chaotic brain. She looked at Zock, whose face was twisted with rage. A question popped up. Why hadn't his appearance changed? Only her, Jack, that woman just now, Ariel's sisters. Their appearances hadn't changed at night. She had originally thought that the reason the mermaids hadn't changed was because their tears could reduce pollution levels. But now it seemed that wasn't the case. Not everyone was restricted by the pollution rules. Only those who changed at night. Sunon's eyes were bloodshot from suffocation. A faint air of death shrouded her face, just as she was about to pass out. The strength in Zock's hand suddenly loosened. Sunon fell to the ground. She opened her eyes in disbelief, only to see that the ferocious, triumphant expression on his face had frozen, and his eyes flashed with confusion. That mountain-like body fell down bit by bit in front of her. Even until his death, he still maintained the expression he had before his death, completely not understanding why he had died. Sunon leaned against the wall, one hand covering her neck, wiping away the tears that were naturally produced in her eyes. In her blurry vision, she saw the person standing behind Zok after he fell. That mysterious woman. She was holding the dagger that Zok had kicked away, looking at everything with a horrified expression. The blood on her hand was still dripping down. The woman blinked and released the dagger, squatting on the ground and covering her head. "See God above, what have I done?" Her body trembled, continuously reciting prayers, begging for the sea god's forgiveness. Sunon leaned against the wall and struggled to get up. She walked over and squatted next to the woman. She picked up the dagger and patted her shoulder. The woman's body trembled heavily, and she raised her head to look at her with a dazed expression. Sunon's face was covered in blood, but her gaze was very firm. She used her index finger to dip in the blood on the ground, and wrote on a relatively clean spot on the ground, "The sea god will forgive you. You were just protecting yourself, killing an evil person." The woman looked at the words she had written, and a trace of color finally returned to her pale face. She asked, "Who are you, and why are you here?" Sunon continued to write, "Call me Ellie. I'm investigating the truth behind the missing castle maids." She wrote with certainty, "You're Emma, right?" 2 lines of clear tears streaked down Emma's face. "What about the other maids?" Emma covered her face and began to sob. "They're all dead." Her body began to tremble in fear. The prince is a complete and utter pervert. He actually did. I saw it with my own eyes. He, in front of me, killed a maid who worked with me." And then she bent over and started vomiting. As Emma's voice fell, the system's voice sounded in Sunon's mind. "Every once in a while, young and beautiful maids mysteriously disappear in the castle. Prince Beric says they disappear because they angered the sea god. But is that really the truth?" The surviving maid, Emma, finally unravels the truth. It turns out that the outwardly charming prince is actually a complete and utter pervert. Those young girls have all fallen into his clutches. Congratulations, player. You have uncovered the truth behind the missing maids. You have received a side quest reward. Magical seasoning. Description. This bottle of magical seasoning only needs a little added to food, and no one can resist its wonderful taste. It may also have a slight side effect of numbing the body. Everything made sense now. Why at their first meeting, the prince looked at her with that kind of gaze? And why, after learning that she was a vegetarian, he had revealed a satisfied smile? This so-called storage room was the place where he enjoyed his perverted tastes. She felt a wave of nausea. Emma beside her was still retching. Her stomach was empty, and she couldn't vomit anything. It took her a long time before she painfully straightened up. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she looked at Sunon and asked, "I've never seen you in the castle before. Are you a new maid?" Sunon shook her head, to be precise. "And I pray he's taken a liking to." Sympathy showed on Emma's face. Sunon had many questions at this moment, but this was clearly not a good place to talk. She quickly wrote, "I think we should leave here quickly." Emma had been knocked unconscious and brought here. She didn't know exactly where she was. She could only choose to follow Sunon. The storage room had just been unloaded of a batch of goods. No one should come back in the short term. Sunon glanced around casually. Huge piles of dead fish were in sacks and randomly thrown in the corner. She and Emma together laboriously dragged the 2 dead men into the corner and used some things to cover them up. The light here was dim. It wouldn't be easy to notice if one didn't look carefully. What was even more fortunate was that the temperature in the storage room was very low. The bodies wouldn't start to stink here easily. This could buy them some time. The 2 of them walked up the stairs to the entrance. Sunon locked the door again and took Emma back to her room. "What do we do now?" Emma asked anxiously as soon as she entered the room. Sunon pointed to the bathroom, signaling her to go wash up first. "Then what about you?" Sunon let out a rare bitter laugh. Both of them were covered in blood and had come all the way from the basement to the 2nd floor. They must have left a lot of traces. She had to clean them up. Sunon changed into a clean set of clothes and went out with a wet towel. She wiped away the bloodstains that the 2 of them had accidentally left behind along the way, then dragged her tied body back to the bedroom. There was already a faint light from the sky filtering through the clouds. She finally relaxed and realized that her whole body was aching terribly. It felt like she had been run over by a big truck. Back and forth, she couldn't control it any longer and closed her eyes and just fell asleep like that. She didn't know how long she had slept. Sunon's eyelids were swollen and heavy. She couldn't open them no matter what. Vaguely, she heard someone calling her name. "Miss Ellie, Miss Ellie, it's time to get up for breakfast." The 3rd day had begun. Sunon struggled to open her eyes. Everything before her seemed to be spinning. The maid outside, because she hadn't responded, sounded a little anxious. The sound of the door opening also got louder. "Miss Ellie, can you hear me?" Sunon took a deep breath. She thought that if she continued like this, she wouldn't be killed by the copy. but rather by sleep deprivation. She propped herself up on the bed with both hands, and sat up to look at Emma, who had already woken up, and had a look of fear on her face. Sunon pointed to the direction of the bathroom, signaling her to hide first. While Emma was hiding, she picked up her paper and pen and got up to open the door. Miss Ellie, you finally opened the door. The maid outside the door smiled. The prince and princess are waiting for you. Sunon squeezed out a shy smile, and wrote on the paper, I'm sorry, I overslept a bit. Please tell the prince and princess I'll be there after I wash up. The maid left. Sunon closed the door and returned to the room. Emma came out of the bathroom, and asked worriedly, what should we do now? They'll find out sooner or later. We won't be able to live if they do. The things in the storage room were being unloaded today, and were actually prepared for the wedding. Then the speed at which those two corpses would be discovered was probably faster than she had imagined. Sunon thought for a moment. Maybe it was time to tell Lily that she had found Emma. It might help. She took out the hairpin that Lily had given her and held it in her palm. In her palm. During breakfast, Grace told Sunon that they would be getting off the ship this evening to prepare to return to the palace. The wedding was imminent. Everything had to be prepared in an orderly manner. Derek also wiped the corner of his mouth very elegantly, and looked at Sunon vaguely. The wedding is coming soon. I'm sure Ellie will be very excited. Sunon felt disgusted by this pervert to the extreme, but she still had to smile at him, and nodded as if to acknowledge. The smile on Barak's lips deepened. He sighed with a good mood. Lily's cooking is still as good as ever. I really can't live a day without her. Grace, who was sitting beside him, covered her mouth and laughed. You always say that. I'm going to get angry. Sorry, my love. You know my heart only belongs to you. Derek took Grace's hand and kissed it. You like Lily's cooking too, don't you? Indeed. Grace looked at Sunon, and sighed from the bottom of her heart. Ellie, you can't taste it. It's such a pity. Sunon took a sip of the black tea in her cup and smiled noncommittally after breakfast. Sunon went to the kitchen and found Lily. I found your sister. She pulled Lily to a secluded corner where no one was around, and wrote directly. The expression on Lily's face went blank for a moment, as if she couldn't believe it, staring blankly at the words on her paper. You found him. Sunon nodded vigorously. Lily suddenly pulled a delighted smile, revealing a row of neat teeth. Where did you find him? Where is he now? Tell me quickly. I want to see him immediately. Sunon revealed a sorrowful expression, and frowned in some difficulty. What's wrong? Lily asked anxiously as expected. Did something happen? You have to help us. At dinner time, Sunon's bowl was, as usual, only filled with some potatoes and vegetables. She was focused on cutting the potatoes, when she suddenly heard noises outside. A group of people were running back and forth, as if they were looking for something. What's going on? Grace asked with some surprise. It's nothing. It's just that I've lost something. They're helping me find it. Derek elegantly brought the piece of fish on his fork into his mouth. What did you lose? Was it very valuable? Grace frowned and asked. It wasn't anything valuable. Derek's gaze subtly swept over Sunon. It's just that a little mouse somehow got onto the ship, and chewed up things in the storage room, and let go of the food I carefully selected. It's quite a headache, mice. Grace frowned in disgust. I hate mice. Sunon's movements of cutting the potatoes paused. She understood that Derek had probably already discovered the two corpses in the storage room. It was faster than she had imagined. She calmly picked up a piece of potato and put it in her mouth. Suddenly, a man barged in, and ran over to speak to Derek in his ear. Derek listened to the man's words with a calm expression, and waved his hand, signaling him to step down. A relaxed smile appeared on his lips. He kissed Grace on the cheek. My dear, the delicious food I prepared for the wedding has been found. He looked at Sunon, and said slowly, Ellie, you should also be careful. We'll be getting off the ship in a bit. It wouldn't be good if you left anything behind. Sunon's face went pale. Derek deepened his smile, and took a sip of the black tea in the cup. The smile on his face abruptly disappeared. His eyes became cold, and he became furious. He violently grabbed the cup in his hand, and threw it hard against the wall. The cup shattered into pieces. The scalding hot tea splashed on the ground. Sunon was startled. This was the first time she had seen Derek in such a rage. During the day, he always acted like a prince. So elegant. Who made this tea? Derek roared. Are you trying to scold me to death? Grace, on the side, wasn't surprised at all. She showed Sunon a casual smile, and reached out to pat Derek on the back comfortingly. Derek, why are you getting so worked up? Lily, who was on the side, also looked scared, and didn't even dare to breathe loudly. The restaurant was silent. After a long while, Derek's heaving chest gradually calmed down, but his anger hadn't subsided, and he got up and left the restaurant. I'm sorry, he's not usually like this. Grace sighed, and said to Sunon helplessly. Sunon looked at Derek's departing figure, lost in thought. It was just a cup of tea. Why was the prince so angry? She couldn't help but write down her question. Derek usually has a very good temper, but when he comes into contact with anything related to food, he can't control his temper. Grace explained. He has extremely high standards for anything he puts in his mouth. If he eats something he's not satisfied with, he will fly into a rage. This is also why he likes Lily so much, because the food that Lily makes is very much to his liking. I see. Sunon smiled slightly and got up to help Lily clean out the teacup that the prince had just smashed. Lily looked up and gave her a grateful smile. When Sunon returned to her room after dinner, Emma was already gone. There were messy footprints scattered on the floor, and the door also showed signs of being forced open. Lily followed her into the room, and when she saw everything in the room, she couldn't help but frown and asked worriedly, "What should we do now?" Sunon's face was calm. "The wedding is the day after tomorrow. You must be very busy these 2 days. Don't let them see any clues." Lily nodded, of course. It was already evening when they returned to the castle. Sunon was exhausted and just wanted to get a good night's rest. This was probably the last night she could spend peacefully. In this copy, early on the morning of the 4th day, according to the previous routine, Sunon washed up and went to the restaurant for breakfast. Grace looked very happy. Her voice was full of excitement. The wedding is tomorrow. It will definitely be very lively then. From the past few days of interaction, Grace seemed to be just an ordinary person in the copy. Barrick also looked very excited. The look he gave Sunon was almost undisguised lust. While using a knife and fork to cut the food on his plate, he stared intently at Sunon. Sunon seemed to be oblivious to his gaze and focused on eating the food in front of her. She had already decided to use that dagger to kill the prince tonight. "Ellie, how about you be my bridesmaid?" Grace suddenly said with great interest. Sunon paused slightly and revealed an embarrassed smile. She lowered her head and wrote, "Wouldn't that be inappropriate? I'm just a palace maid." "There's nothing inappropriate. With me here, no one would dare say anything." Grace didn't give her a chance to refuse. "I have a lot of beautiful bridesmaid dresses there. After breakfast, we can have you try them on. Those bridesmaid dresses are all made by the best tailors. You'll definitely like them." She finished speaking on her own and looked at Barrick. "Barrick, what do you say?" Barrick put down his knife and fork and wiped the corners of his mouth and said with a smile, "Since you like it, then let's do that." They didn't give Sunon a chance to refuse, and she couldn't refuse. So after breakfast, Sunon was dragged by Grace to a fitting room full of bridesmaid dresses, just as Grace had said. Each one of these bridesmaid dresses was exquisite and made by the best tailors. Grace grabbed a white lace dress and excitedly handed it to her to try on. Sunon had no room to refuse, so she had to put on the dress. This dress unexpectedly fit her body perfectly and perfectly hugged her lovely figure. It was strangely coincidental that it had a mermaid tail design. She swayed gracefully as she walked. Aside from not being convenient for running, it was almost flawless. As soon as she came out, Grace let out a gasp of surprise and rushed over to hug her. "Oh my God, Ellie, this dress was simply made for you. Promise me that you will wear this dress as my bridesmaid, okay?" But Sunon awkwardly tugged at the hem of the skirt. This dress was really hindering her movements too much. "What's wrong? Don't you like this dress?" Grace released her and asked with some disappointment. She was planning to kill Barrick tonight, without the hosts of the wedding. This wedding simply wouldn't be able to be held, so Sunon smiled and shook her head, deciding not to waste time on these trivial matters. "I like it very much," she wrote. "I'll wear this dress as your bridesmaid, to witness your most beautiful moment." "That's wonderful." Grace hugged her again, her tone full of expectation. "This will definitely be the most unforgettable day of my life." At midnight, Sunon pushed open her door. She had made ample preparations for everything today. In the afternoon, she had gone to the sea and fully come into contact with the seawater. Although her pollution level had increased a bit, thankfully she had a few remaining pearls after swallowing them all. Her current pollution level remained at 20%, a relatively safe number. Barrick's attack power at night would be greatly increased. In order to kill him with her own hands, she had asked Lily, during dinner, to add some sleeping medicine to the prince's food. At this moment, Barrick should be sleeping soundly. According to the rules, before the wedding, Barrick wouldn't be able to hurt her. This was her best opportunity. She couldn't miss it. Sunon walked to the door of Barrick's room and inserted the dagger into the crack of the door and easily opened the door. The wooden door made a soft creaking sound that was particularly noticeable in the quiet night. Sunon paused until she confirmed that there was no movement in the room. She carefully tiptoed into Barrick's room. The room the prince lived in was twice as big as hers. The moonlight was bright tonight, and the cold white moonlight shone into the room through the window. Barrick hadn't closed the window tightly, and the cold wind outside blew the gauze curtains by the window. The shadows on the ground swayed slightly. Sunon held her breath and focused, and slowly walked to the large bed in the middle of the room, and used the moonlight to look at the person on the bed. Perhaps it was more appropriate to describe him as a monster. Sunon's stomach churned. Even though she had mentally prepared herself, she was still disgusted. She took a deep breath and raised the dagger in her hand. The dagger reflected a flash of moonlight and the beam of light happened to fall on Barrack's eyes. The sleeping prince's eyelids twitched, showing signs of waking up. Countless experiences from novels and dramas told Sunon that if she hesitated even for a moment at this time, it would be her who would die. Her eyes became cold. She lifted the quilt and unhesitatingly swung the knife down. The sharp dagger stabbed down towards Barrack's heart. Just as the dagger was about to pierce his chest, the dagger was suddenly grabbed by someone. Sunon's eyes widened, looking at Barrack, who had woken up at an unknown time. A hideous smile appeared on his terrifying face, and one hand gripped the dagger tightly. At the point where his palm met the dagger, a sizzling sound like a fuse was produced. This dagger was indeed fatal to him. She had no time to be surprised. Sunon pressed the dagger handle with both hands and pushed down with force. The smile on Barrack's face gradually gave way, and he let out a painful howl. His palm started to emit white smoke, and finally he couldn't bear it anymore, and released his grip, and shouted while holding his hand, and the dagger in Sunon's hand, without any obstruction, due to inertia, directly pierced into his chest. You dare? Barrack's eyes widened, and squirming maggots crawled out of his eyes. Sunon, for fear that he wouldn't die, even rotated the dagger in her hand, with force, inside his chest. A chilling grinding sound was heard. Barrack was like a deflated bellows. His throat released a hoarse shout. His voice was venomous, and echoed in her ears like a curse. Do you think you can kill me like this? He widened his eyes, and actually laughed. You will absolutely not be able to leave here alive. Barrack's breath slowly faded away. Sunon pulled out the dagger. Blood gushed out of the hole in the prince's chest. The mermaid said that she needed to smear the prince's blood on her legs before she could turn back into a mermaid. Sunon's face was cold, and she brought the glass bottle she had prepared earlier to the bloody hole in Barrack's chest, and collected half a bottle of blood. She put the collected blood away, and couldn't help but look again at Barrack on the bed. He was lying in a pool of blood. His eyes were wide open. His black pupils filled his eye sockets, and his lips curved into a faint smile. It was very disturbing. She forced herself to endure the discomfort, and pulled the quilt from the side over, and covered his head, concealing that grotesque face, then quickly left Barrack's room, and returned to her own room. Sunon washed her face, and cleaned the blood off her body. Her hands were propped up on the sink, and she couldn't help but doubt if Barrack had really died like this. Was everything too easy? Although everything was within her plans, she still couldn't put her mind at ease. Barrack's last words were echoing in her head again and again. She had already personally killed the prince with the dagger. Now she just needed to wait for tomorrow morning. Without a groom at the wedding, it naturally wouldn't be able to be held. Everything would go as she had planned. Sunon took a deep breath and pulled out the blood she had collected earlier from her chest, planning to examine it again carefully. The moment she saw what was in the bottle, her pupils contracted slightly, and the bottle in her hand instinctively slipped, and she forcefully smashed it against the wall beside her, with the sound of glass shattering. The things in the bottle scattered open. It wasn't blood at all, but rather countless squirming maggots.